Hello and welcome to the Fireside Chat. Today is May 3rd, 2018. Fireside Chat is a get-together of Gridcoin community members, and we basically talk everything Gridcoin, from development to ideas to news. This week we will be talking about an idea that has been floating around our little conversation here for a little bit, and we talked a little bit last week about it. It's called MicroGrid, how to get BOINC projects set up so researchers with not a lot of data can get that data crunched. But before we get into that, let's just get into the news, which really isn't much this week. The most we got comes from the POGS project, Skynet. They actually completed all their work units. They finished everything they needed to do for what they set out to do, which is awesome. So congratulations goes out to them for that accomplishment. I'm pretty sure their next step is going to be building some sort of neural net that helps identify galaxies based on their characteristics, and they will be doing that off of the work that we all did for them by just contributing our computing power to the data that they needed crunched. So good, congrats to them and good work to all of us for helping get that completed. It's pretty cool to hear.
Yay us.
And before we go any further, I forgot to introduce co-host here. This is hosted by myself, Jay Ringo, and the Goblin Popper down below.
Hello.
And over in the corner, as always, you've got I Like Chocolate.
Hey.
So today's topic actually kind of relates to what just happened with POGS. So the basic concept is that there are projects that don't have unlimited work units. You know, SETI has unlimited work, coalesce conjecture has unlimited work, any sort of cryptographic project will probably have unlimited work, but for a large portion of research that needs data analyzed or simulated, there's an end to the project, which isn't a bad thing. It's just a thing that we need to recognize and maybe work towards. And there are in fact some projects that are very small and don't have a lot of work at all. So we're just going to throw this over to Goblin Popper, and he is going to walk us through how MicroGrid sort of relates into relates to those sorts of projects. So go ahead, Goblin.
Yeah, so for everyone who doesn't really know, so when I first started getting into GRC, I was kind of like everyone else, kind of just fell into it slowly and got more in the community. And at some point, Jay Ringo had posted about needing someone with economics background, and I did, a number of classes on it in college, and I'm on the internet, so I pretty much said I'm an expert, and got involved in some of the economic groups. And one of the main topics was about like demand and figuring that out. And whenever you talk about like the demand and the price for Gridcoin, one of the major things that struck me was there needs to be a reason to buy it. There needs to be a want or desire for it. And where can we help kind of fill gaps of, like a supply, right? And that kind of eventually started to morph into an idea that Jay Ringo and Chocolate and I kind of came up with, which is MicroGrid, right? And the concept of MicroGrid is a GRC community-run BOINC server that helps small-time researchers, people like college professors or hobbyists, with a small set of work units that can be broken up and put on a BOINC server, and then that distributed out to the GRC, right, to crunch. And so the hope would be that it wouldn't really be tied to magnitude, it wouldn't be tied to the daily give out of GRC, it would actually be compensated for via making it rain feature. So the point would be that you kind of advertise this to a small-time researcher, you work with them, you give them the tips on how to actually, no, that's not trains, I'm sorry, in the background. So you give them tips and explain how to actually process and put the information up on a BOINC server. They would constantly feed that, probably with something like a couple hundred or maybe even a few thousand work units. You might get some people with tens of thousands, but reasonably things that would probably get processed within a month time frame. And then once, we'd encourage them, although it wouldn't be mandatory, to make it rain, to encourage people to actually process it. Because that wouldn't be generating GRC, it would help create a demand for GRC and help kind of drive up the price, as well as kind of increasing the flow back and forth. So it kind of has a twofold nature to it. That's not how it needs to work. That's kind of how I just kind of envisioned it working. But more importantly, it is a very cheap way to give researchers access to things like a very strong supercomputer or grid network. My experience in this has always been that you either need a really big budget or you need a really big benefactor to effectively agree to it. Like you have to appeal to a company that says, yeah, we'll process it. So this kind of helps give an entry point for all those smaller users. Am I forgetting anything, or is that pretty much sum it up?
I think that sums up how I remember it. We didn't really go into the money aspect of it. We did talk a lot about it, but the main principle is exactly what you said, to give people who don't have a lot of work units the access to Gridcoin network, which is the 22nd, 23rd largest supercomputer in the world, based on some napkin math, essentially. But
yeah, and I do want to make sure I also mention one other thing. In 1 second. Sorry about that. Again, I have rabbits. So the one thing, I'll see you later. So the one thing that I do want to make sure I mention is so the conversation was brought up that potentially what could happen is a company could come forward and say, hey, look, a really cheap way to do data processing. I imagine like Aetna had, or imagine like Pfizer had medical research or drug information that they wanted to process overnight or over the course of a month. And they could potentially appeal to GRC and say, hey, we'll pay you like $5,000 worth of GRC, like rain it over the project, over the entirety of it, if you process all our information. And like that's kind of defeats the purpose of what it's for. So at the end of the day, it wouldn't just be this open thing where people can dump work units, make it rain. It would be community led in terms of someone would put forth their idea, their thesis, and say, this is why I need the process. This is the kind of organization where 20 people group, and so on and so forth. So there is some things in place to help restrict people trying not to abuse it or companies coming in that we don't agree with. But yeah.
Right, and that's because we will likely have another structure to deal with commercial entities who would like to get their data crunched in the future. I think MicroGrid is a more near-term project because it targets more of who we're looking at right now, which is just small-time researchers, people who have these small projects they want to get done really quickly. And I also want to describe what RAIN is really quick for anyone who doesn't understand or doesn't know it yet. So the RAIN feature it's a functioning feature of the client right now where, let's put it this way, there's a BOINC project, and that BOINC project is crunched by a bunch of CPIDs. And the Gridcoin blockchain aggregates those CPIDs into the neural network and into a superblock. So what is possible with that is to have, let's say I have 10,000 GRC and I have a project that I want to incentivize people to crunch. So I say, look, I'm going to rain 10,000 GRC to everyone who crunches project X over between now and the end of May. And it will be proportional to how much you contribute based on everyone else also competing for this rain, also working on that project in this time period. And then at the end of that time period, you take the data, the user data, the user contribution data of that time period, and then you basically say, I want to rain 10,000 GRC over it, and it all gets distributed to those people based on how much they contributed. So that is Project Rain, and MicroGrid is a way to use that on a project that might not have a steady magnitude because it might not always have work units.
Also, I seem to, it happened before we started recording, and it came up again while we're recording, and that's Golem. I don't know much about Golem. If someone wants to explain what Golem is or how it's relating to what I'm describing.
I can, unless someone else wants to.
Golem is basically exactly what you described, except open to anyone that wants to purchase work units. At least that's how it's pitched. I don't know that they have much working quite yet. I know that they had a couple of big updates for Q1, Q2 of 2018, but I haven't really kept up with their latest updates, though.
It's more or less. The big difference is Golem is an ERC20 token, which means that they operate on the Ethereum blockchain, it comes with benefits and drawbacks. I see mostly the drawbacks of operating as a token versus Gridcoin, which is its own blockchain. It's a cryptocurrency that incentivizes a specific type of participation. For example, we don't have a set number of Gridcoin ever created. We're a protocol inflationary currency, protocol-defined inflationary currency. Golem has a set number of tokens. They were created all at the beginning, and there will never be more unless they just decide at a whim to make more, which is kind of like, we can get into how that relates to contemporary politics maybe after the show. Operating as an ERC20 token, it sets up a different sort of economic structure versus operating as a cryptocurrency. They are two very separate things, and they are starting to be approached as separate things in the larger financial world. For example, it's very difficult to call a cryptocurrency a security when it's actually very easy to call a token a security. They're very different beasts. So at its base level, Golem is very much like what we just described. You buy Golem, and then when you need things computed, you sell those Golem to the people who contribute. But it operates completely on their own infrastructure, which is not built yet. And the recent news from their lead devs basically said, this is much harder than we thought it was going to be, but we'll see how it goes. I think we're going to do all right. So we'll see how that goes. Meanwhile, Gridcoin has something that already works. We're working off of BOINC, which is an amazing program.
Yes. So what I will add is, remember, anything we say about MicroGrid is right now is conceptual, right? I mean, I know I'm slowly, ever so slowly, working on like a Steemit post for it, and then eventually we'll have to actually like vet it out. So anything we kind of say is how we envision it. It's not really any final, right? So someone in the comments, Nethlek, mentioned like a delay rain, like what happens if we do a lot of work and someone says, oh, thank you for all the work, I'll totally buy GRC and make it rain on you, right? Make it rain on you, make it rain. And the answer to that would be, I'd assume conceptually that it would work in a, I'm forgetting the term, like the way that they do it on a
An escrow sort of system?
Yeah, like they do it on an escrow. But the nice thing that would help us to distinguish from what I'd hope the way Golem works would be that you could potentially petition the community to say, hey, we're very small. We only have like, $500 worth left, like money to help contribute towards this. But we have a lot of work units, and you could potentially say, hey, can I, does anyone want to contribute to this project's reign, right? Does anyone want to help encourage the environment even more to process that? So there are a lot of ways we can play with it, since it isn't a direct, you're buying processing power, but you're more or less rewarding someone for processing your stuff. And I think that has a very important distinction just based off of expectation and compensation and so on.
So I think that's a great difference that you just brought out.
You should also be careful about how that might incentivize these companies. So if you're saying, okay, they have to buy Gridcoin now and then rain it on every single person who is crunching their project, as opposed to if they had more work units, they could actually become a full Gridcoin project and then not have to buy anything. And so it might incentivize some of these, actors, whoever they may be, to make up a bunch of nonsense computations and just take up a lot of wasted computational time. So we might. I'm just pointing out we have to be careful about how exactly we're funding this and who it's coming from and where it would go.
Yeah, and that would be primarily controlled because we would. What we reward GRC on is controlled entirely by the community, like the whitelisting process. So, it's pretty hard for them to get a whitelisted project to be approved to actually get that, or just to get a project on BOINC, and then on top of that to get approved for our whitelist. So there's multiple levels of what someone actually has to get approval for, but it does in a way encourage it, saying, well, I don't have that much GRC, or I don't want to buy it, or I don't have that much time, or I don't have that much money. But what they can do is they can effectively build up a credit by crunching it themselves way ahead of time and saying, I was able to get 5,000 GRC from all the crunching I've been able to do in the last year, or like 2 years or whatever, and I'm going to use this as like my deposit. I'm going to help use this. So there is a way of actually getting people to crunch more in order to get the compensation, or to get the usefulness out of it. But there's also ways for people to pay, and again, the main drawback, not drawback, but economically speaking, the main issue with the price of GRC, and the reason that's kind of what I envision, or at least what I see as holding us back from having a much higher value, is the fact that there's not much of a reason to buy it other than people just wanting to hold it and have it and like contribute to it. And so if you're not really into wanting to have it just to have it, or not to just to contribute to the actual concept of it, there's not much reason to buy it. And the only reason to sell it is I'm done supporting it, or I have too much and I want to get some compensation, or I want to get my electrical costs back. So there's not too much incentive to buy and sell it. And so to help kind of open up, or to kind of help open up that process and encourage more buying and selling would, I think, encourage a lot of other things and so on. But yeah, voting and staking, yes.
There are a couple points, and I don't want to get into the creation of demand quite yet, because I want to talk to you about that, Goblin, because we have very differing views on that. But I will say that the demand of a token is very different from the demand of a currency. A currency has demand that's not artificial. A token has an artificial demand structure, which is what you just described. But before we get to that, so Robotic Mind just asked, why not have one project that combined all the small computations from smaller researchers, which is what the original thought of MicroGrid is. So we've been talking about the compensation part of it, the brain aspect of it for a little bit. So the reason that we want Rain to be involved with it, or that we think it should be involved with it, is because it's a BOINC project that's going to have a limited number of work units that will run out regularly, because I mean, unless there's a bunch of researchers with a lot of data who just can keep backlogging it up. So at the current structure, where you build up rack, and rack gives you magnitude, and then your magnitude decays when the project runs out of work units, that wouldn't really incentivize people to crunch that project, right? They'd have no reason to contribute to MicroGrid. So the idea is, look, you don't need to continuously be crunching MicroGrid. You don't need to spend the time to build up your mag on this project. You will be rewarded because someone set up a rain pool for contributors to that project. So that might be less of a problem in a sort of TCD structure. TCD is total credit delta, which is another proposal from the 4.0 roadmap that we will likely be discussing next week, if not the week after. So please come back. But in the current structure, we need a way to incentivize people to actually crunch this project when it comes up, without having to spend weeks building their magnitude up. The main concept of the project, though, is what you said, to get a bunch of small projects to give us their work units, because they don't have the funds to set up, or the means to set up their own BOINC project. So we did all the back-end work for it. You give us your data, we'll format it and host it as best we can and get it crunched and send it back to you however you want it. That's the main purpose of the project.
Yeah, the only kind of distinction we would have to make between the projects themselves within MicroGrid, because the hope would be that everyone agrees on what they're processing within MicroGrid, and then kind of whenever you get a work unit, it would be kind of either whatever's on the top of the queue, or just kind of a random work unit in that selection, and that you're okay with that. But the only kind of distinction we'd have to make between them would likely be like a MicroGrid GPU and a MicroGrid CPU.
That's a good point.
Only because, not every computer has both, and not everyone's computer is geared towards processing both, so you'd have to distinguish that way. And then, I mean, if you want to really get down into the weeds, you might have to also have like a MicroGrid ARM, right? Like chip, and then an Intel chip, and you can segment it a couple of different ways unless there's something to kind of check what work units your computer can handle, and would give it out as that. But again, this is very highly conceptual, and the reason why we're talking about it today is kind of, we thought it was a really cool idea and we want to get some feedback on it. And do you think this would work? Is there anyone currently in the community who would actually be like, yes, I could totally use this tomorrow or yesterday if you had it? Because ideas are great, but having someone set up a BOINC server and actually have it hosted 24/7 with a very good connection. Like, I can put up a laptop in my corner, like the corner of my office, and just be like, yeah, it's BOINC server, right? But it's got to have a very strong Ethernet connection, and it's got to always be up, and I have to be monitoring it. So doing that, making sure that server is always up, is a little bit of work. And working with the actual people to get the work units on it is not too much, but a little bit of work. So, just make sure that you don't have all this work go into something and then there's no interest in it, right?
Right. That second part you just brought up, I think we should not think about right now in terms of like what it would cost to get it set up and the actual logistics of getting it running. But that first point you had, is there anyone in the community who can give us feedback about, like, would they use this thing? Is this useful? Like, I know Snip, you do PhD work that does data crunching. Is this something that you and people would find useful?
Currently, I'm in a situation where I have I've got good access to supercomputing systems. Excuse me. But if I switched to a university where I didn't have a supercomputer on hand that I could have work units for on demand, then yeah, I could see myself jumping on something like this. Though I'm kind of surprised that you're looking more toward the RAIN side of things rather than something like the World Community Grid umbrella project, a bunch of small things all tied into one idea.
Well, it would all be tied into one idea, but the difference between World Community Grid and MicroGrid is World Community Grid, realistically speaking, has such constant demand and constant backfill that it's not going to run out anytime soon. As MicroGrid is getting off the ground, there's no guarantee that you could even have enough work to build up a magnitude. And then once it runs out, with the current grayless system, as I just found out, once it runs out, and it runs out for a couple weeks, which might happen often, who knows, it would go onto the gray list and your magnitude would drop back down to 0 for your contribution on it. So if we were giving people GRC based off their work done on it, it would be extremely inconsistent, right?
That makes sense.
So it's more or less just to be like, well, who wants to process the project that has no guarantee of actually giving back the compensation of like the GRC that you built up. So that's the kind of the main reasoning for that. If it were to get to the World Community Grid level in terms of a lot of people constantly filling it, and it has a backfill that would take months, right? I'm sure it might be an idea that people would entertain, to be like, let's just compensate this in a standard method, kind of like a museum, in that you don't have to pay to get in, but there's that big sign and someone sitting at a booth saying highly recommended, $20, right? So that's kind of how I envisioned if it actually got going, is, someone pretty much strong arming a donation. But other than that, and so actually,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was actually going to ask Snips just, it's, if you didn't have access to supercomputers, because this is like high CPU intensive academia is not really where any of my skill set is. So it's like, what is your alternative if you don't have access to that? Like, is a lot of budget used towards that? I really don't know that space at all.
So that really depends on the university that you're at and what kind of projects you're on. You do always have the option to submit a proposal to Blue Waters or one of the other big supercomputing systems. That doesn't cost anything, to my understanding, but it is a fair amount of paperwork, and you need to get that proposal approved. Now, where I'm at, there is no cost associated. It's all baked into the university budget. And you have to submit a proposal at the beginning of the year for your lab group's total amount of work units that you expect to need throughout that year. That proposal gets accepted or rejected with some revisions, whatever, and then that's the total amount of work units that you can use throughout that year on that supercomputing system. That can be adjusted throughout the year a little bit, but that's kind of what how it works where I'm at right now. I've seen some other ways of handling things where there was kind of a buy-in system where if your lab contributed a big chunk of money toward setting up the supercomputer, then you have some amount of preferential work units that get you ahead of the queue for a certain amount of time. But it just really depends on where you're at, how that's handled.
I think we can take that model and change it to, instead of pitching a proposal to a central entity saying, this is my proposal, you give me time based on what you think of my proposal. You pitch it to a decentralized entity where you pitch it to the community and say, here is my proposal, you give me funding to continue my work as long as you think that my work is useful. So it goes back to last episode when I was talking about the scientists being incentivized to educate people as to why their science is important. So there's this structure that I hope to talk about in a future episode called side staking, where I think Robotic Mind actually touched on it a little earlier, where you pitch a proposal to the community and the community automatically, they're able to split their research rewards or their stake rewards into microtransactions and send those microtransactions to different proposals that they agree with. This already exists in BOINC coin, which they use it for philanthropic purposes. You can split your staking rewards into, you keep a little bit of it or most of it, and you split small transactions into charities or to marketing for BOINC coin or to development for BOINC coin. And those small transactions add up because you have a network of 100,000 people. So if you say, I have all these work units, I want to get on the microgrid system. I want to make it rain on the contributors of my work units when it comes time, because I want them to get crunched quickly when my work units come up on the queue of the microgrid crunch list, whatever you want to call it. So, donate to my project's RAIN fund for microgrid. And people will be like, I love that science you're working on. I love what you're doing. Here is 0.00001 Gridcoin. And, a bunch of people donate 0.0001 Gridcoin. It turns into, you got like 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 100,000 to rain down on people. So it's not necessarily that the scientist has to put the money forward to begin with. They don't need to have that in funds. They could have those funds to help start it, but it can come from the community. A lot of communities are really willing to donate, especially if it's built into the wallet right off the bat.
Honestly, until this is very well established, it would be a pretty hard sell to convince a grant that they should be throwing money at, a cryptocurrency, right? It's honestly kind of comical.
That's fair.
Currently, right?
Right.
100%.
We're not talking about grants, although that should be something in the future. But just like me or Chocolate or Goblin or Neuromine or whoever, Milk, Leadfree, we just throw like 10 Gridcoin at this project to rain down on their crunchers. We are the funds for the grant. It's not coming from the government.
Yeah, and remember that, like, unlike the way I'm interpreting Golem, I might, correct me if I'm interpreting it wrong, there's no set value to one GRC worth of processing, which means a researcher could technically be like, listen, I don't even have any money, but I got like $100, or like I have like $20. Would $20 of GRC make you guys happy? And the answer is like, realistically, if someone was getting $20 worth of GRC spread over all the crunchers, it might be like a little bit, but knowing that you helped a small time researcher might be worth it to a lot of people. I know I would probably still do it just because. There's the train. I mean, I know I would still do it, even if it was just like, I spent like a week processing and I was getting something like, 1 or 2 GRC a week from it, right?
Just regarding like the symptomatic what you were saying earlier, and also about the not having enough work units to build up a magnitude. So if we do switch to total credit delta, that wouldn't be as much of an issue. And there is theoretically a possibility, if we're able to properly measure contributions to a project, we could actually reward crunchers for crunching really small projects. If we can accurately measure and verify the work that's being done. That's it's a stretch, but I mean, that is a possibility. And if we're able to do that, roughly even, we could even Jay Ringo, what you were describing earlier about funding projects, we each send 10 Gridcoin, 20 Gridcoin, whatever. If we can reward smaller projects to the same extent, by the same measurements that we reward whitelist larger projects, we could also, send 10 or 20, Gridcoin to this project, and then, receive it back, by crunching it. And I mean, that's basically what you were saying, but like, it's something to think about, that process of, where, at the end of the day, you send this, you could even send it, 1,000 Gridcoin, depending on, how much, you're, crunching or whatever, you might actually be able to get it all back. So, it really is a way to, it's like a really powerful tool for the community to fund, science projects.
I think I like what you're saying. Just to make sure I understand, you're saying you fund the project with Gridcoin upfront, and then you essentially end up earning your Gridcoin back by helping complete their work.
Basically. So that to some extent, that would definitely require some level of community approval, because that could easily go awry. But that's basically the idea. Also, another thing I wanted to point out about getting universities to jump on board. I'm a big fan of that, but we should also just remember it might be difficult to justify using grant funds to buy a cryptocurrency. It can be done. I'm not saying it can't, but it's not like I don't think that's going to be an easy sell like right now or in the near next couple of years.
It would be easier to get private grants, but.
Yeah, bro.
I think in the background of all this that we're talking about, in terms of funding these projects to get crunched, we have to keep in mind that there are ideas for development in terms of reward distribution that will negate everything that we're talking about. Like TCD makes it so that you are rewarded based on the amount of credits you have crunched on a specific project over 24 hours or between super blocks. So you don't need to spend that time charging your magnitude. And then if all of a sudden the project runs out of working units, you just switch projects. You don't need to, your mag decays and then you find a new project and then you rebuild your mag and then, that project's out of work units. There's none of that whole jumping around. So TCD does help a lot of that. So at the base of it, do remember that this project is about getting small batches of work units into BOINC. And not so much about the rain feature, although the rain feature is a very cool aspect about how we can fund science that I think is definitely worth talking about and building on moving forward.
Also, I mean, it would have to be obviously go through community approval, but I would actually likely say I would want to encourage a small-time researcher who gave us units for MicroGrid to actually process their own stuff, right? Because the hope would be that once they have it set up, they would just leave it running to help the next person, right? And in the future, if they earn anything back, they could use what they earned to actually do it again, right? So there is value in doing it. I totally understand what you mean, right? Like they're earning their own stuff back, but hopefully there would be enough people processing it where they're only getting 1/1000th of what they actually paid into it if it was distributed out evenly or however, right? But I totally understand that concern.
Yeah, for sure. And we should also keep in mind, just like we might want to send projects that go to the microgrid through a similar whitelisting process, not unless it's completely untied to the actual Gridcoin minting reward mechanism. So if it's so it depends exactly on the situation.
Even if it was untied entirely, and we did do 100% rain feature, I would still 100% support an approval process, right? Because I would definitely, without an approval process, there's too much potential for, well, one, that would mean that we'd have to open it up and effectively just say yes to whoever sent us an email, unless someone somewhere was saying yes or no to someone, to the people who were contacting them. But then on top of that, it's saying it's minimizing abuse from people who might pretend to be small-time people and just be sending us random work units, right? And I'm not saying people are going to send us Bitcoin hashing tasks, right? But there might be a lab in a major organization that just says, wow, it would be way easier to just do this as opposed to look for approval internally, right? People that don't necessarily need it. And I think the point is, as much as I talk about the demand, and as much as Jay Brigham and I argue back and forth about the economics of it,
we haven't started.
We haven't even started. But the point is, as much as we do bicker, the main point of this would be to help small-time people, right? And unless there's an approval process, I feel like it lends itself too much to potential abuse. So,
I agree.
Yeah, that maps. It really is analogous to a larger set of issues that that has been discussed and will continue to be discussed by the community in regards to what Gridcoin is and what values we represent. I mean, I think that most people would agree that the people that are participating in Gridcoin are not there just to simply quote unquote make money, and this Gridcoin is not about basically providing an arbitrary computing mechanism. There's got, to me, part of the reason about Gridcoin is its connection to science and pursuing, avenues of research that provide value to mankind in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I'm not specific about what it is. It could be mathematics. It could be medical research. It can be searching for black holes. It could be, there's all sorts of different things. And I know people have different opinions about what is worthy in terms of computing causes, but and I know that there's been arguments back and forth about the existing projects, some of which, should they be included, shouldn't they be included? But I can't tell you what's a great project, but I can certainly tell you what's not.
That's a good point.
Companies trying to sneak in arbitrary processing time on garbage crap is not good stuff, and I don't think people in Gridcoin really want to be associated with that. So I agree. There's got to be some sort of approval process. No matter what, we can't. I don't think we can just open the door up to whoever wants to send, get processing power. That's just too open, in my opinion.
Yeah, and
any comment?
I don't know of any. I mean, maybe I just don't get out enough, but I don't know of anything or any organization that I would quote, refer to as legitimate that doesn't have some approval process in place to get in, right? Either you even have to apply and there's a 90% chance to get in, but it still needs an application, right? Because otherwise you're pretty much saying, hey, we'll just unsecure, non-encrypted channel, just dump work units into a BOINC project over here, we'll send back the answers, is definitely not the way to go. So, I mean, it would definitely require an approval process at board. Even if we had an internal board that was open to as many people who wanted to be on it, or just a forum that would have posts, or it was just done through the wallet, right? Doesn't matter.
Governance structures get complicated, but
but you know what I mean. I'm saying an internal, a Slack channel where all the polls happen, as opposed to in the wallet, right? Not a board per se, but just something that anyone can just show up to and say, I vote.
Perfect example of how I would see this thing getting built is how we're building the gray list. The gray list is currently run off of 2 people. It's completely centralized with the intention to get it So if you are listening to this recording, you may have noticed that a little audio was cut off. That is because for the second week in a row now, our beloved recording bear decided to take a siesta, and we may have lost some great banter, but we're back now. So we're going to get right back into it. We're talking about MicroGrid. And what were we just talking about?
I know Jim was talking. I don't know, Jim, if you want to repeat what you were saying, or if you remember.
We were talking about the governance structure of MicroGrid. Just not to force Jim to unmute everyone and go through everything, but how if we do start this, how it would start. It would most likely start as a sort of very, very transparent entity of like a group of people, preferably a large group of people, that decides what work units get put in place, and the details of that would be worked out, like who has access to the email, how many people have access to the email, because it would of course have to be more than one, ideally more than 5. But it would be more transparent than, as much as we love WCG, than what WCG just did with their 3 successful new projects that are going to put under their umbrella, where they basically just said, we had a team of experts for scientific merit and in IBM scientists, which is all right, cool. I'm sure like we sort of trust you, but let's be more transparent than that, because we are an open source community that is a little more, let's just say a little more. So that, I think that's what where we were at. It's like, if we want to do this, this is how we'll start. So does anyone here, we've got a bunch of people here who've been listening to this hilarious conversation the entire does anyone think that this project is a bad idea, or shouldn't be pushed forward, or shouldn't be explored in any sort of way?
Or does anyone here want to back my idea of economics?
Like, if no one wants to fight us on this concept, then I will talk to you about supply and demand of currency.
I'm still.
Oh, and one thing I do. Oh, sorry, who was it?
No, I was just gonna say I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, so I can't really give you a yes or a no on if I agree. But go ahead, Goblin.
No, I was just gonna say to address a question I know that didn't get included in the audio was Emma and Maddie in the chat asked like how many bad whitelist projects tried to come forward and get declined by Gridcoin, and I did want to ask that because I don't remember how it happens, but my understanding is that the project, like we kind of seek out the project and we can actually tell the project like, hey, you're being reviewed for be whitelisted for us to process, and then we review it internally if we want it, and obviously they have to say yes or no because their system has to be ready to handle all of us pinging it. But outside that, I don't know, do people come towards us or do we go towards them? I don't know the approval process for our whitelist.
I actually didn't think that we were asking permission. I thought it was more in a sense we did. Is that right?
No, we did not. We did.
Okay, yeah. I thought it was like, hey, we want to whitelist you, but you don't meet our requirements. So here's our requirements, and hopefully you guys change some stuff and we can start crunching you. I thought that's what the usual approach was.
So the whitelisting process is being actively developed, and it's since I've been active in the community, it's gone. I haven't done anything to do with it. It's mostly GUK and others. It has gone so much further than it was before. It used to be, we just like a project. We're going to put it out for a poll. If it passes the poll, we're going to whitelist it with complete disregard for the project. That caused some problems recently. I don't remember the project name off the top of my head, but they just couldn't handle us. We are a large network. Like, we have a lot of crunching power behind us. It might have been SourceFinder, yeah, Goblin.
The source of all my magnitude.
So what we said is, look, we probably want a whitelist and a graylist process. That would be cool, so we don't need to keep voting to whitelist and delist projects over and over again. So that got built. That was an amazing effort from the community in GUK. Again, I keep shouting him out, but he put a lot of work into that. And we also put forward one of the rules, I think, in that proposal is that we're going to reach out to a project before we actually whitelist them and say, look, we want to whitelist you. Is that okay with you? And like, they have to say yes. They have to be like, okay, we're ready, and we come with them with like, this is how much power we're going to come at you with. This is like the infrastructure that you should probably have in place to handle what we're about to do to your work units, because BOINC is fairly small, and we are a huge portion of it. Are we one yet? Are we number one? Anyone know? We're up there. We're top 5 easily.
We're actually number 4 right now. I just checked. And we're 5, and we're gonna be 4 in I think a week based on our daily credit.
Right, we're growing like crazy. So we want them to be able to handle the amount of processing we're gonna throw at them. We can't just like throw it on their servers without them being able to handle all that new work. So that is a new thing that has come about, and I'm sure that as we continue to grow as a community, as a network, we're going to make it even more structured and make it even more of a partnership between us and the projects themselves, not just us operating and BOINC operating. We want to be part of BOINC. We want to help BOINC. They are the thing that we build on. Without them, we are just a POS blockchain, proof of stake, not piece. So, so we want them to succeed. We want them to exist. That's our incentive. Our incentive is to make them grow. And as BOINC grows, they're going to have to also continue to build their internal processes. I know they just had a developer conference call, and they're starting to really structure their stuff. And they recently have David Anderson, who was a huge proponent of the early BOINC system, who helped build it out of study, recently got some NSF funding to build a new project called Science United. And they're really trying to build this up because distributed computing is a huge part of what we are as a society are going to be in the next 10 years. So they want to be part of it. And they should be. It should be a volunteer-based system. They don't want only for-profit systems to exist. They can exist, but they also want theirs. So we need to continue this rant. The summary of this rant is we need to continue to build this process. It is not the smoothest it could be, but it has gotten so much smoother over the past year that I have seen alone. And I'm sure Gridcoin's been around since 2013. I'm sure it's improved drastically over those years as well. So keep in mind to continue to work to make it even more smoother. Don't think that it's at the best it could be right now. Don't ever think that. Always try to improve.
Yeah, to comment actually on an earlier thing that was mentioned in that rant was simply put, I mean, we're not right. We're not like it's not that we're like asking permission or so whenever we want to get them on our whitelist, but anyone who's small and who might only have a few, like tens of thousands of work units that we might burn through in like a month and a half, the hardware they're sitting on is probably very, very small, right? And the issue is, it's effectively like putting it on the whitelist and having everyone suddenly jump on is effectively like a DDoS, right? Like we're effectively like DOSing their box, and it makes them go down. And usually if they have a small box, it's because they have a very small IT team as well, right? They don't have a lot of money entirely. So their IT or the group that manages that is probably overwhelmed, and it takes a couple weeks to get them back up after we just destroy them and rip all the work units out. So it doesn't really help on a lot of fronts, and their credibility in terms of being a whitelisted project, in terms of just being a project on BOINC and not being able to keep their server up, it doesn't look good on them. So us showing up, it's kind of like the Reddit or Imgur hug of death. Right, it's the Gridcoin hug of it's the hug of death, right? Where we're like, yeah, you typed
it at the same time.
Yeah, so it's that's kind of what it is, and that's kind of why we have to go about it in a slow manner of like, hey, we're going to. Are you okay with this? Because we're going to destroy you if you're not. And if you think of like, okay, so what do some of the big projects have? Some of the projects actually have their hardware listed online. I highly recommend checking out what SETI has and what World Community Grid has as hardware behind the scenes. It's extremely impressive when you see the sheer number of cores and the hardware that they have. Like, it's really impressive to see how much SETI and those big ones have behind the BOINC. like as BOINC servers. So, and then you look at like something like smaller that just as worthy, but something much smaller like a source finder, right? Where they have, I don't know what their hardware was or what their hardware currently is, but I mean, it definitely wasn't as much as it needed to be, or the work units weren't as numerous as they needed to be. So,
and we were in constant contact with the admin, and they weren't ready for it, and they didn't have the hardware, as you're saying. So this also talks. I'm looking forward to the side staking episode because it's a way to maybe fund BOINC projects and help them get better hardware so they can handle this sort of processing load. But it speaks to what we as a cryptocurrency community, basically a Federal Reserve, what we can do to help fund scientific research projects. It's amazing to me. I look forward to discussing it with all. But back to MicroGrid. Does anyone have any comments or anything?
That was a large segue.
It was.
as we do.
I want to, if no one has anything to bring up off the bat, I want to go back to what Goblin said. We've got maybe 10, 15 minutes left here. About creating an artificial demand structure for Gridcoin, the coin, which is something that would happen under the Project Rain system, where if we tried to make it like Golem, where you buy Gridcoin and then you rain it over a bunch of contributors. Currency, the way demand for currency operates is based off of essentially trade. That's basically it. There are three main things. I can't think of them right now, but trade is the huge one. If you have to trade with someone else and then you want to convert your earnings into a currency that you can use at the grocery store, that creates demand for that currency that you traded into. So US dollars is valuable because it's used in so many places, primarily America, which is a huge monetary country. So it's not created off of forcing people to buy US dollars to use them somewhere in the way that you're describing it, Goblin. It's a very natural set of demand. It's not like pegging a bunch of countries to your currency. Right? Does that make sense, Goblin?
A little bit.
All right. I'm fearful of creating an artificial demand structure where you encourage people to buy Gridcoin so that they can spend it right away. That's not how currency works.
No. So what I'm hoping to do is not necessarily create a system where they buy it to spend it right away, but more or less that there is a purpose to buying it, right? So, and the big distinction would be that if it has a purpose to be bought, it doesn't necessarily need to be bought, but it could also be earned. So, like the example of a small-time researcher contributing months ahead of time processing power to get Gridcoin to spend towards people to help them process when they do have the work units. But more or less, it's about keeping the circulation going. Which again, I want to make this very clear, right? Like, I'm academically, I'm very interested in seeing that kind of happen and seeing that kind of churning and that process grow. But additionally, it's not like I have gobs of GRC sitting around that I'm like, yeah, it's got to get to $1, so I'm rich. It's more that the price increasing would also significantly help the treasury, which would help fund the development for and ensure kind of the future of it, right? It's not that the price strongly dictates the future of a currency, and that if this doesn't hit 20 cents and stay above 20 cents for the rest of it, it's not really going to be a thing. It's more that with the amount of GRC that you have to pay a developer with, it helps when we have the GRC already and its price grows so that we can help fund more developers and use that to kind of encourage them, right? So it's more or less like helping the community just get more out of it, I guess.
Right, I get that. And there's nothing against raising the price, but how do you raise the price? You don't want to do it artificially. You don't want to create a system where that system collapses, when that system collapses, because systems collapse, then the price collapses because of it. You want to create something that's completely natural. A more natural way to create a demand for a currency is to make that currency used in places, which is going to happen naturally no matter what. in cryptocurrency. Like, I mean, I say no matter what, I think it's highly likely where, you know, you can use multi-currency economy, you can use any currency to buy anything at any time. And the demand for a particular currency is based on the trust of the network behind that currency, not so much what that currency is used for in a artificial structure. Like, you know what I mean? That's what a token is for. A token has demand because it's used in a very specific system, in a very specific way. Golem is used for one thing. You buy Golem so that you can use it to buy processing power. GRC is a currency that is earned by working, and that work is scientific processing.
Well, based on what you said, we are like a currency then that kind of functions like a token, because ours is kind of purpose specific, you know, scientific research.
But you don't need to use Gridcoin to buy scientific research. We're built on top of a volunteer structure. We're built on top of BOINC, which is volunteer computing.
And small-time researchers are more than welcome to put out a request saying, I don't have any funding. I have $20 in my pocket. That's all I got. Who wants to help fund the rain feature for my small work units, right? And then we basically figure out with Chocolate's help on some of his other theories with the flop to work. We might be like, okay, so our goal, you have 5,000 work units. How many would take? I don't even know how flops. I don't really know flops. So it's like, each flop should be equal to like so many decimal points of a GRC of processing. So
that is what I'm scared.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm saying it's like that would just kind of help to like keep it balanced, but that's not really the end goal. The end goal is, I mean, I don't know. It's. I think we differ on a very fundamental level on some of this stuff, which is why it's a little hard for us to like fully understand the back and forth, because it's a very fundamental. It's not a high level kind of understanding. It's very fundamental. But I still respect your opinion and I enjoy the conversation.
Right. And it's the fear is that we pigeonhole ourselves into this one thing that creates demand for Gridcoin.
And
versus
Chocolate, you were trying to say something.
It's a bunch of things. Jaringo, why don't you finish? Then I'll go.
Oh, by all means, I'm finished.
I was gonna say, I mean, regarding the price, just looking at it from just like a really, I guess, more naive perspective, I think a huge turning point in Gridcoin would come if the price of Gridcoin was at a level where it was profitable. Now, profitability depends on location, absolutely. But once we start hitting that point, then we could, we would attract an enormous, user base. And with an enormous user base comes, increased transactions and use. Jaringo, and I totally agree with you about the value of a currency coming from its use. I definitely don't want to see Gridcoin explode to $10 a coin, because I don't think it's worth that. I think that would probably be very bad, because it would probably crash after. But I do think that once people start using it, then we can. Then people will really start to see like, oh wow, we can really fund stuff like this. And regarding like the Goblin, when you brought up the flops to GRC, I mean, one of the side effects of that, if that ever happens, is that we can now tie GRC to energy consumption, and if that happens, oh wow, well now we can on a more or less stable, reliable level trade GRC with green energy tokens. Right, and so and GRC might be wanted in some other location for some computing purpose, and then the green energy coins might be wanted in some other location for some other purpose, and then that's how we start building networks and creating real flow, the real velocity of money.
So
velocity. Sorry, go ahead.
So I agree with all that. I have another worry, and that. Look, at the end of the day, you guys know we have essentially a constant kitty, right? So we've gone through that math before. It's basically we're distributing 28,000 roughly Gridcoins a day for research.
And, it's interesting to, that comment about profitability is an interesting one, because if you think about the dynamics of a system with a constant subsidy, which is what we have, and you think about, the price of the coin going up, which then encourages more people to participate, the problem is that's automatically equalizing, meaning that if you're distributing the same kitty amongst more participants, it's then going to devalue their participation. So one of the challenges that we have with our current system, which is why at the end of the day we're going to have more funding sources to pay people for research besides the subsidy, because the subsidy is inherently non-scalable. I'm not talking about technically, I'm talking about economically. You're distributing the same 28,000 tokens to, as more people join and more people crunch, each person gets less. Right? So that's one of the things that we have to think about is, is the kitty the sole source of funding to encourage people to produce research or to do research? And I think the answer is no, which is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this initiative, talking about RAIN, talking about side staking, all the other things. We got to be thinking a little bit larger than, okay, how do we distribute 28,000 coins? You guys know what I'm talking about? It's a big concern if we're really going to have the network get a lot bigger.
Yeah, and that's really another one of the reasons why I pushed a lot towards, especially like MicroGrid, if nothing else, being an example or like a test environment where the RAIN feature is the method of actually distributing the GRC, right? Because in that kind of system, we're not actually drawing from any of the we're not forcing the blockchain to create more to fund that, right? We're using the current circulation.
Exactly.
Right? So we're helping reduce and take off that load. And you could even start to go into the whitelisted, like if it works so well and you get so much notoriety and you get that what we're referring to as legitimacy earlier, you could almost push into the white label group of saying like, well we're going to reduce this, but if you're willing to like give us, X number of GRC or like make it rain X number of GRC, like we keep you on the whitelist and which is probably like 25-30% of their processing power of their project.
Yeah.
I think it's ground we should tread very carefully, just in a general sense. If we're opening up money to, if we're asking for money kind of thing to incentivize the crunching, I think it's really kind of hazy terrain.
Yes, and I want to make very clear that it's like that sounds super like capitalistic and super like I'm trying to make this into a business. It's really not. It's if anyone's really interested, I highly recommend going to the Slack channel. And I know like Jibringo right now is like doing push-ups or trying to get his anger out or something. But it's with my comments. But it's like I highly recommend everyone go to the economic Slack channel and kind of contributing. But it was a little eye-opening. Yeah, please come join. It's like I stepped away for like a couple weeks to do my job, and I come back and I like fell behind horribly with the conversation and haven't contributed much. But the point being, it's like please come in and look at it, because nothing's more eye-opening than seeing how GRC is created, the scale at which how many are released every year. Because the problem with all other cryptos, right, have some kind of system where they take what's currently in circulation, right, via transaction fees or whatever, in order to fund the staking or the proof of work or whatever, right? Like Bitcoin will eventually stop or get extremely close to stopping distributing new Bitcoin, but will still have proof of work rewards via all of the transaction fees, right? Like it stops at circulation and the supply isn't infinite. GRC suffers from this small issue of we don't really have that mechanism, so it's kind of just a continuing line up. And until that's kind of capped off or maintained, there's always going to be a constant slight devaluing, which there's a lot of methods to fix that, and this is just one idea towards that. So it's really not me trying to capitalize on and make this a business. It's just it's a thought exercise on how to control that kind of potential runaway train.
I see where you're coming from. I see it so differently though. It's Bitcoin is like a commodity. They call it the gold of crypto. And that means there's a limited amount of it. So you have to its price is based mainly off of scarcity. When you have a currency is not a commodity. There is no limited amount of US dollars. They're continuously printed at the based on the wisdom of those in charge. So what crypto does is says no, it's going to be printed based on a protocol. So everyone can read the protocol, know exactly how many are going to be printed in what time period, whatever time period they want to look at. And that's immensely that's valuable. That's very, very valuable. Compared to just it's called inflation. What you're talking about is inflation, and you can't. Inflation is necessary? Question mark. Cryptocurrency makes it a little more of a question, but inflation at its core means that you have to keep producing more to maintain the same amount of value. So it encourages people to continue producing more. So it's not a bad thing to not have a limit on the number of Gridcoin that's minted. Perhaps you increase the number of GRC minted per day. Perhaps you do all these other things that can combat inflation. But
I agree. It's not a problem to never have like a cap, but to never have the function slowed down is my concern, right? If it's a percentage based or if it's a constant linear based, you have a problem, right? It needs to be more of a like. I'm thinking back to calculus. I haven't thought of math. Right? Like it needs to be more of like a logarithmic, right? Where it slows down significantly, but it doesn't necessarily have to. No, percent-wise is like speeding up, right? Unless I'm thinking of that wrong. If it's like 3% every year would be speeding up.
No, you're thinking about it right. A lot of cryptocurrencies do this curve where they start with a high inflation rate because for one reason or another, and then they reduce the inflation rate to a small number towards the end. So they start at like 4% and they work towards 1.5% based on a protocol. It's a very predictable structure that is not just like, well, 6 of us think that the inflation or that the interest rate should be raised because we need to combat inflation, and then we need to print a little more money to increase monetary. Like there's none of that human aspect of all this put into a protocol, which is the valuable part when it comes to economics in crypto. And I think that's what we're talking about right now. And Jim, you're coming up next, but we are going to start wrapping this up. But to continue the conversation, come to economics on the Slack channel. It's a lot of fun, and this is the stuff we want to work into. Go ahead, Jim.
Oh, absolutely. That's I think that Gridcoin as it's currently structured, as we all know, is inflationary, but the inflation rate is going down over time. Of course, we've had a lot of discussions in the economics Slack channel on this, and there's discussions about the implications of that in the CBR documents. And then, but the interesting thing about it is that we certainly don't, we can't just pump up the subsidy to support, more and more folks getting what they believe that they deserve for crunching to pay for their power bills. That would cause runaway inflation. So it's an interesting problem that we have to think through is in terms of, what is the right answer? And I know in the economics forum, we've talked about alternative models where we go to a constant inflation rate rather than a constant value of kitty, right? Or constant. So there's a lot of different things that we got to think through as time, in the future. And it's tough. I mean, there's a lot of different forces that we have to, I think, balance to make sure that we that the community exercises the right stewardship over the coin. It's not easy. And look, but I think the interesting thing is, at least as far as I'm concerned, we're being very proactive and very transparent about these things, and we're documenting it, and we're having polls to make critical decisions, and to me that's a heck of a lot better than a lot of the just about everybody else out there in terms of what they're doing. So
yeah, and I do want to bring up one thing. Just I'm going back and forth in the chat with Net. Like I'm terrible with names. I'm sorry, but we're just going back and forth, and it's important to note, right, that like linear linear growth isn't necessarily bad, right? Depending on the rate of linear and a bunch of other factors. But I do want to make sure this is kind of spoken out very clearly. It's not like this isn't a bad situation we're in right now. Like it's not dire. This isn't like GRC is going to crash overnight. This is a huge issue. This is like Forkpocalypse 2.0, right? That's not it, right? This is something that I just want to make sure that we have thought out and have options for, and have resolutions for if it ends up being an issue, or if this develops into a larger issue in like 4 to 5 years, right? Like in 4 to 5 years, I can see this being like, guys, we should probably maybe like think of some methods to do, right? And I'd rather us just be proactive while the chain is developing. Don't dump all your GRC. Don't do that.
I agree. I agree with that completely. I think that I don't think this is an issue that's like a red alert, we got to solve it now issue. These are things that we can deliberate on. Seriously, I mean and we should. I mean, through discussions and thinking through the various different issues, my belief is we'll arrive at the right answer as a community in due time, and I think we have the time for the issues we're talking about. I agree. So
absolutely, dude. To both of you, absolutely. And it's we get these things started now because you're right. Like 4 or 5 years down the road, they're going to be a little more important than they are now. Right now, we're worried about Forkpocalypse. We can always think back to Forkpocalypse, and things will never be that bad again. Fingers crossed. But you've got a great community building great, amazing things, and thinking this far ahead into the future, trying to make things sort of all come together, because we're dealing with economics, technology, supercomputing, science, and like a lot of different aspects with people from a lot of different communities too, who are just starting to work together and starting to talk together and like really come up with these long-term solutions, like MicroGrid, which can help small-term scientists, people who don't have work units that will last for months, to get onto BOINC, which is an amazing. BOINC itself, forget Gridcoin. BOINC itself is the 3rd largest supercomputer in the world. They are huge. The processing power they can bring to these scientists is amazing. And if you just have a PhD student with a month or 2 months worth of projects, work units, and maybe they aren't in line, like Snip was saying earlier, they're not in line to get on their network because the professors are in line before them, or maybe they don't go to a university with that sort of resource, they can come to us and we will give them this stuff. And they don't necessarily need to buy the Gridcoin to get there, because remember, the main reason is to give them access to this computing power. And maybe we can work some economic systems into it as we build it, but that is why it's there. And we're building stuff like that, and we're just going to keep going. And there's just so much great stuff coming forward. So we are well over an hour right now, so we're going to wrap up here on that. I'm going to give a moment for last words if anyone wants to say anything here towards the end.
yeah, I have one thing to say, and that's for science. I'm number 489 in the world individually in BOINC, and I've been doing this far longer than I did in Gridcoin, and I didn't know about Gridcoin for a long time. And when I found out about it, I was like, finally, there's something that really sparks an altruistic nerve for me, and it is personal for me that to be involved in something that aspires to really improve humanity and really make a difference. And to me, that's radically different than everything out there, and that's what the real ideal is here. And we have to remember at the end of the day, this really is for science. It really is to improve humanity. And I'll leave it with that. So,
absolutely. I guess we'll just close on that right there. So join us next week on Fireside Chat. We're here every Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern, midnight UTC. Maybe we'll be talking about TCD. We've got a whole bunch of things lined up on what to talk about. TCD, the voting structure, side staking. If you have any ideas you want to hear fleshed out, if you want to hear me and Goblin go back and forth about something in particular, please bring it up.
Grab a drink and stay late. But Also, more importantly, if you guys have any ideas, feel free to message any of us or just show up and totally take over on one of the Thursdays. So
Definitely. You are more than welcome to own the majority of the talking time. But yeah, other than that, we will see you next week. Thanks for joining us this week, and have a good weekend, everyone.